Hey everyone, welcome to the Unnecessary Nonsense Podcast YouTube channel. So first of all, my apologies for missing out on week 5. Life got in the way a little bit, but we're back here for week 6 talking about Alliance of American Football. So same thing as the last couple of videos here and there. We're going to do the scores here, talk about it a little bit. We're going to do the screens captures today. And then probably we'll do another video later on where we do it a little bit differently. But for now, let's stick with this just to keep it short and simple. So let's look at the scores and then we'll talk about the individual games themselves. So first off, we had the Memphis Express losing to the Salt Lake Stallions 22-9. We had the Arizona Hotshots upsetting the Orlando Apollos 22-17. That was the first loss for the Apollos. Then on the Sunday, we had the San Antonio Commanders pretty much crushing the Atlanta Legends 37-6. And lastly, on the Sunday night, it was actually a pretty good back and forth game where the Birmingham Iron basically squeaked out a victory against the San Diego Fleet on the last second field goal, 32-29. How we got there is a little bit interesting, but we'll get to that in a second. Let's start off with the Memphis Express taking on the Salt Lake Stallions. Now, the Memphis Express game itself actually had a lot of consequences to it, which ended up having implications for something we'll talk about in a minute. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to talk about, really this game came down to something very straightforward. Memphis got down 16-0 in the first quarter, and they were actually down 19-0 before they started mounting a little bit of offense to come back. One important notable element of this game was, and I'll show it to you here, if you're looking at the passing statistics for the Memphis Express, you're looking at Silvers here at quarterback rather than Mettenberger. Mettenberger was injured in the very first offensive possession and basically never even got to complete a pass. So the ankle injury basically has taken him out of the game. And with Silvers at quarterback, he equated himself reasonably well, got a touchdown, 242 yards passing on 62.2% completion percentage, which is not terrible. Zach Stacy really didn't get much done in terms of rushing. Offensively, Memphis just couldn't put anything together with the backup in there. So looking at it from the Salt Lake side of things, Josh Woodham had 243 yards on just shy of 65% completion percentage, 2 touchdowns and an interception. It wasn't really a dominating performance from the offensive standpoint. 22 points really isn't that much, but it was enough given that Cardinal Schultz was able to get 2 sacks on the defensive side of the ball, and Memphis was kind of in disarray offensively, trying to make something of the game with their backup quarterback in there almost immediately, unexpectedly. As I said, Zach Stacy for Memphis really wasn't able to get much done there. That's where the Salt Lake defense was able to stall the few offensive weapons that Memphis was able to muster. The consequence of this was that they didn't even bother or even consider bringing in Christian Hackenberg. And not surprising given how poorly he had played up until this point. Now, while it's difficult to speculate, it isn't really unreasonable to assume that the poor performance and the sudden injury for Mettenberger was at least part of the decision-making process that led to the biggest story of this week for the Alliance of American Football, which came outside of it in terms of personnel. So here's that story. Johnny Manziel ends up with the Memphis Express, not surprisingly given their quarterback situation, which has deteriorated. Realistically, I'm not completely sure. It'll be interesting to see. Once Johnny Manziel signed the contract with the Alliance of American Football, and it's something that I considered making a video on separately, but I thought I'd talk about it briefly here. I'm not sure if Memphis would have picked them up, given that San Antonio, which, in Texas would have been a very interesting decision for them. They had first right of refusal with the college rights. They decided to pass. They decided to go with Logan Woodside instead of taking Johnny Manziel. Mind you, Logan Woodside was performing, while not amazingly, was performing more consistently. And Johnny Manziel, no matter how much quote-unquote star power he has, and in terms of bringing eyeballs to the league, he's very much an unknown quantity. Since the end of his college days, he really hasn't performed well at either the NFL level or in the Canadian Football League. I'm not going to speculate on specifically what happened at the end of the Canadian Football League. We all have our theories. But realistically, when you get kicked out of another league, whether it's you doing something or whether you doing something, not doing something intentionally to get kicked out, it doesn't show anything in terms of your maturity and in terms of your ability to meet your obligations. It's not a good look. And so now Johnny Manziel finds himself in a third different league in 6 or 7 years as a professional. It's really going to be interesting to see. Obviously in Memphis, they're at a point where beggars can't be choosers. So as soon as San Antonio gave up the rights to Johnny Manziel and surrendered him to the rest of the league, it became a matter of going in terms of waivers. Memphis, having the worst record, was able to have basically next right of refusal, and they decided to pick up Manziel. Again, not surprising given that they don't really have another quarterback, and Hackenberg definitely doesn't count. So you might as well take a chance on Manziel and see if you can get something out of him. It'll be interesting to see how that goes going forward. So that's really all I have to say as far as the Memphis game. Let's get to the next game on the docket. Next up was a close game that ended up being a little bit of a surprise upset of the week, where the previously unbeaten Orlando Apollos lost to the Arizona Hotshots 22-17. Now, this was kind of an interesting back and forth game. As you can see, Arizona got up to a lead in the first half, and then the second half was pretty much the two teams just struggling to generate any kind of an offense until the fourth quarter. Realistically, Arizona was able to successfully do the one thing that no other team had been able to do, which was to completely hold down the Orlando offense while at the same time generating just enough to be able to pull out the victory. It wasn't a dominating offensive performance for them as well. Now, I would say the biggest difference in the game was, if you look at just this statistic in isolation, Garrett Gilbert, 268 yards, looks pretty good. But he did drop back 48 times and only completed 23. When you're under 50% completions, it's not a great look. An interception doesn't help. 2 touchdowns is great, but it's kind of what's become the standard for Orlando. It kind of gives you the idea of why the team struggled a little bit on offense and wasn't able to generate what they could normally do. And given how poorly Arizona had been playing up until this point, it was a big win that they really needed. Rushing was kind of split up between a couple of different players. Nothing too crazy going on there. Receiving, Marshall was able to get just shy of 100 yards receiving, but Johnson was very disappointing with only 4 receptions and 28 yards. That really held them back and prevented them from being able to use their full offense the way that we had become accustomed to up until this point. At 5-1, Orlando's still very much in the driver's seat, but things had begun to narrow a little bit, which we'll talk about a little bit more in the last game when we finish our review. The early game on Sunday was basically the San Antonio Commanders destroying the Atlanta Legends. It really came down to the story of the first half. San Antonio got up to a tremendous lead, and then they continued that in the second half, completely shutting out Atlanta. It was more of a case of the statistics being very misleading. Obviously, the score was really one-sided. Logan Woodside played well, I would argue better than Aaron Murray, but statistically, the two quarterbacks couldn't have looked any more different. So now I'm going to go down and show you some of the stats from this game to give you a better idea how we ended up here. So really the misleading statistic of this game was that Aaron Murray here completed nearly a little over 73% of his passes, 215 yards, which isn't terrible, 30 completions. But the big number here that set off the difference was 3 interceptions. 1 touchdown, didn't really help to offset that. It was a game truly of turnovers. Atlanta was able to get yards, but even when they did, and when it seemed like they were moving efficiently here or there, those turnovers ended up being hugely costly. And when you're turning over the ball like that, you're leaving your short fields for your opposition. So San Antonio was able to capitalize on and take advantage of it. You can see from the game leaders, Kenneth Farrow II was leading the game, but he led the game with only 35 yards rushing. That's for the whole game. Looking at the San Antonio side, there isn't really that much that should impress you very much. Logan Woodside was extremely efficient, almost 74% in terms of completions, but only 17 completions in total on 23 attempts and 164 yards. The biggest difference, though, whereas Aaron Murray was getting more yards and more completions, Logan Woodside was able to actually have 2 touchdowns. And then Kenneth Farrow, even though, again, not a lot of yards, was doing almost 4 yards a carry and did get a rushing touchdown. It wasn't very pretty in terms of offense, but it was enough. And I suspect that the fact that San Antonio was at least seeing that kind of efficiency, even if it's not lighting up the scoreboard, was at least part of the reason why, given that their quarterback situation is more stable, that they decided to pass on Johnny Manziel. I would suspect that's part of it. Overall, this has to be a very disappointing performance for Atlanta, who had really been seeing some improvement under Aaron Murray, so this wasn't really his best performance. It's probably his worst performance thus far in the league this year, so it's going to be interesting to see if Atlanta is able to bounce back. Again, there's not too much more to add on this game since it was very much a one-sided game. So let's go to the last game for the Sunday. Okay, so this was by far the most interesting game of the week in terms of the back and forth nature of it. You can really see the ebbs and flows in the game when you look at the way the score went. Birmingham taking the lead, and then San Diego coming back, and then Birmingham claiming it at the end of the game in the fourth quarter. It ended up being on a last-second field goal where Novak completed it in order to secure the victory. I guess the most interesting thing about this game was really the way we ended up here. Going into the game, Luis Perez had basically lost his starting job to Keith Price, but for some reason, I haven't been able to get the exact nature of it. Keith Price was injured, but it seemed like a fairly minor injury. But that basically opened the door for Luis Perez to come back in and basically be, I guess, the hero of the game, but I'm putting that kind of in quotation marks, and I'll explain in a second why I'm questioning it. Let me go into it here, and you can see obviously in the game leaders, Luis Perez threw for 359 yards, which stands out completely. It comes off the page. But if you take a look at it even marginally deeper, you really wonder a little bit. So almost 50 passing attempts to get the 359 yards, a 55% completion percentage, not incredible. 3 touchdown passes, which were actually the first 3 touchdown passes for Luis Perez in this season, go in week 6. And he had been a starter for the first 5 games, only losing his starting position in the 5th game to Keith Price only after he had performed so poorly. In this case, obviously, he came in relief of Keith Price, who had completed 3 out of 4 passing attempts. So it was kind of an odd time to pull Keith Price, unless there was presumably a more serious injury. Now, like I said, 3 touchdown passes is great, but these 2 interceptions were really atrocious interceptions. One of them was basically Luis Perez rolling over to the side and throwing across his body directly into coverage. And another one was another terrible interception. It's kind of what leads me to kind of question Luis Perez going forward. Obviously, this was a good game for him where they pulled out the victory, but it's going to be really hard to win a lot of games if he becomes reckless with the football. Even with the 3 passing touchdowns, this was the first time that he actually had some success, but a lot of it really came down to throwing the ball for his receiver to go get it, and it just so happened that his receivers made plays, which made the whole thing look better rather than a lot of other times where throwing it into that kind of coverage led to interceptions. Again, given that you almost had as many interceptions as touchdowns, even in this victory, it's hard to say if that's sustainable. Now, another aspect that I suppose is a positive for Birmingham, obviously other than getting the win, was that Trent Richardson got another rushing touchdown and did manage to creep up his rushing average ever so slightly. Instead of 2.4 or 2.5, it was 2.9 yards. But he still has not had a signature game on the ground. One thing I did like that I thought was a good move, incorporating it into the offensive game plan, was that he did do a little bit better and got to be a little bit more involved as a receiver with 7 receptions for 44 yards. Again, and even a passing touchdown. If you can incorporate Trent Richardson in this way, even though as a rusher, he's not necessarily breaking any big plays, he's more of an offensive weapon if you can do that. You can create a little bit more room on the field, and it really helps you make the Birmingham offense more dynamic. Again, the quarterback situation in Birmingham is a little bit murky for me. I really don't like this version of Luis Perez necessarily. I like the confidence that he's throwing the ball a little bit more, but I don't like the fact that he's become increasingly reckless in the throws. In this game, he obviously got away with it, but it's going to be questionable to me if he's going to be able to continue doing that going forward with any success. Obviously, at a 4-2 record, Birmingham has closed the gap ever so slightly with Orlando losing their first game, and I'll look at the standings in a minute, and we'll have a look at that as well. Washington obviously also had a breakout performance with 4 receptions for 128 yards, so some big plays out of Washington there. So now I'll talk about San Diego for a moment as well. So Berkovici had an okay game, 50% completion percentage, not amazing. 311 yards is great, but he matched Luis Perez in terms of 3 touchdown passes and 2 interceptions. Both teams were really struggling to actually sustain certain drives, and they were getting neutralized by these turnovers. In terms of rushing, not much better. They didn't perform any better. The big breakout star for the game was Ford at wide receiver. But again, it's a lot of yards, but on only a handful of receptions. It's not something you can rely upon. It's not like 182 yards on 10 or 12 catches. It's 3 receptions, which means you have to break some big plays, which when it happens, you're going to look great. But if for whatever reason it doesn't happen, you have these really lopsided numbers, which look fantastic until you dig even just a little bit below the surface. This was kind of an odd game that ended up being very interesting and compelling. It was fun to watch, but I don't know if it really tells us anything about the actual performance of these teams. I very much like San Diego's offense with Nelson, but Nelson is now out, so now you're going to have Berkovici going forward. I don't know if that's going to be sustainable because I can't really say that he's playing that well. It's working in the sense that they're getting points, but it's a lot of recklessness as well. And Luis Perez, if Luis Perez is going to be the starter again going forward, I don't know if that's going to work. Keith Price, I thought, was more dynamic and was able to generate more offense, but if he got a quick hook with a minor injury, I don't know. Basically, I don't know what the quarterbacking situation is in Birmingham. I'm not sure if they're even sure. So it'll be very telling and very interesting to see what happens going into week 7, who actually gets the start in Birmingham, especially since the team has now kept himself in contention in their conference. So let's have a look at that for a second here in the standings. So like I said, as you can see, the Orlando Apollo still at the top as far as being 5-1, but the Birmingham Iron with their 4th win are directly behind them, and they've put a little bit of distance between themselves and Atlanta, who's now at 2-4, and Memphis, who's at the bottom there. But, I guess they can look forward to Johnny Manziel and see if they can make any kind of a turnaround here at the bottom. In the Western Conference, it's a little bit more bunched up still, as San Antonio did take the division lead, the conference lead, with its 4th victory. San Diego is still kind of treading water at 500, 3-3, and Arizona's big victory kept them in the hunt to try to get that 2nd spot for the playoffs. Salt Lake has just been very much unlucky. Obviously, this win helps them a lot and keeps their hopes alive. So nobody's really out of it in the West. It is starting to spread out a little bit in the East, and Memphis is almost mathematically they're not out of it, but it's going to require a collapse from one of the top two teams in order to give Memphis a real shot to leapfrog, because they're going to have to pass two teams, not just one. Atlanta is still on the outside looking in, but at least they've got an outside shot if Birmingham continues to be as inconsistent as they have been. We'll see how that goes going forward. So overall, that's week 6 in the Alliance of American Football. Looking forward to week 7, so we'll take a look at the games here on the right. We've got Orlando taking on Atlanta. So based on what I said a moment ago, it's a very real possibility for Orlando to go to 6-1 and and really push Atlanta to the brink of being eliminated. Realistically, it's going to be hard after week 7. If they're at 2-5 after week 7, it's going to be really hard to see any scenario where they can get into even the second place spot to try to squeeze into the playoffs. Salt Lake will be taking on San Antonio, again, along the same lines. Salt Lake is there, but they're on the outside looking in a little bit. If San Antonio can claim their 5th victory at home at the Alamo Dome, where they've been getting some great crowds this year so far, the best home attendance in the Alliance of American Football so far, if they can capitalize on that and put together another good performance, move up to 5-2, I think they'll be looking in a good spot as far as the playoffs are concerned. That'll be on the NFL Network. Then on Sunday, you have San Diego taking on Arizona. So right now you've got those 2 3-3 teams trying to create some separation between themselves. Arizona's been a mixed bag. Obviously, they were able to knock off the best team in the Alliance so far in beating Orlando, but I don't really know what it is they are from week to week. San Diego along the same lines. It's hard to tell. Berkovici is doing enough, but at the same time, they're inconsistent. They win a big game and then they lose a big game. It's kind of hard to tell where they're supposed to go from here. And last but not least, on the Sunday nighter, you're going to have Birmingham taking on Memphis. On paper, this should probably be Birmingham taking their 5th victory, but at the same time, we're going to see if Johnny Manziel gets any snaps in on this game. Obviously, as I said, Silver wasn't that great for them. I don't think they want to put Hackenberg back in there. So it really comes down to, can they get with a couple of days practice? Is that enough for them to throw Johnny Manziel in there? And if they do throw Johnny Manziel in there, I suspect a lot of eyeballs will be on the NFL Network checking it out. But at the same time, is he any good? Can he actually play at this point, especially being that he's being thrown in theoretically into the fire in the middle of a season? I don't know what that's really going to look like. I have very little confidence in it, especially since the Memphis offense as a whole has really been up and down. The only time they really showed those signs of life was when Mettenberger was playing at his best, but obviously he's out right now, and that's opened the door for Johnny Manziel in the first place, and even this discussion to take place. But it'll be a very interesting week 7 with some possible storylines. I'm looking forward to it, and hopefully we'll have another video up for that at the end of the games, probably on Monday or Tuesday. And that'll do it for me this week. Thanks very much for watching, and we'll see you next time.